Sometimes a man loses so much that he has to climb a mountain just to find himself again. For 20 years, Eli Boone had lived alone in the Sierra Nevada, carrying the weight of burying his wife and children like stones in his chest. The high country had become his church, the silence his only prayer. He spoke more to ravens than people, more to wind than neighbors. But one frozen morning changed everything. A wolf hung dying from a cliff edge, golden eyes pleading for mercy most wouldn't give. Eli pulled the creature to safety and expected nothing in return. What happened next defied everything he thought he knew about loneliness, loyalty, and second chances. The wolf didn't just survive. It became his shadow, his protector, his guide back to something he thought was lost forever. Could this be more than just a rescued animal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost painted the world silver when Eli Boone first laid eyes on that dying wolf. But to understand why he risked his life for a wild creature, you'd have to go back 23 years to when his hands were softer and his heart still believed in tomorrow. Sarah Margaret O'Brien had been the prettiest girl in Cedar Falls, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper and a laugh that could make grown men forget their troubles. Eli was just a young logger then, broad-shouldered and earnest, saving every penny to buy land up the valley. He courted her proper, Sunday picnics by Willow Creek, barn dances where he'd stumble over his own boots just to hold her hand. Long evening walks where they'd talk about the cabin they'd build and the children they'd raise. They married in the spring of 1979, and by fall they'd broken ground on 40 acres of good bottom land. Eli's hands built every beam and board of their home, while Sarah planted wildflowers along the fence line and hung curtains in windows that faced the sunrise. She had a way with growing things. Vegetables sprouted tall in her garden, chickens laid more eggs under her care, and even the old apple tree that came with the property started bearing fruit again after years of stubbornness. The twins came 2 years later, arriving during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Dr. Henley couldn't make it through the drifts, so Eli delivered his own children by lamplight while Sarah gripped his free hand and told him he was doing fine. Just fine, even though his hands shook like autumn leaves. Thomas came first, loud and red-faced, followed 10 minutes later by little Anna, quiet and watchful from her first breath. Those were the golden years. Thomas grew into a boy who talked to animals like they might answer back, carving little wooden creatures with Eli's old pocket knife and leaving them around the cabin like presents. He had Sarah's gift with wild things. Rabbits would sit still for him, birds would land on his shoulders, and once Eli found him napping under the oak tree with a young deer curled up beside him like a faithful dog. Anna was different, quiet and thoughtful, but she saw things others missed. She'd point to empty spaces and wave hello, tell Sarah about the pretty lady who sat by her bed at night, singing songs in a language Anna didn't recognize but somehow understood. Sarah would just smile and brush Anna's dark hair, saying some children were born with eyes that saw beyond the veil. On summer evenings, they'd sit on the porch while fireflies danced in the meadow. Sarah would read from her leather-bound book of poetry while the children played at their feet, and Eli would whittle or mend harness, content just to listen to her voice wrap around words like wonder and eternity. Those moments felt like they could stretch on forever, golden and unbreakable as mountain granite. But fever doesn't care about happiness, and the autumn of 1985 brought sickness riding in on the first cold wind. It started with Thomas, a cough that wouldn't quit, then chills that made him shake despite every blanket in the house. Anna caught it next, then Sarah. Within a week, all three were burning with temperatures that made them speak to people who weren't there and cry out in their sleep. Eli rode hard to town for the doctor, but Henley was treating half the county and couldn't spare more than an hour. He left medicine and promises, but the fever had already sunk its claws too deep. For 6 days and nights, Eli nursed them with cool cloths and prayer, spooning water between cracked lips and singing the lullabies Sarah had taught him. He slept in snatches, always listening for their breathing, always hoping the fever would break. Thomas went first, slipping away just before dawn on a Tuesday morning. He was holding the wooden wolf he'd carved the week before, and his last words were about seeing a big wolf that would take care of Daddy when he was gone. Anna followed that evening, peaceful as sleep, her small hand wrapped around a drawing she'd made of the family standing under a bright star. Sarah lasted 2 more days, conscious enough to make Eli promise he'd live, really live, and not just survive. She pressed her silver locket into his palm, the one with tiny photographs of the twins inside, and told him love didn't end with death, it just changed shape. Her last request was for him to bury them under the oak tree where Thomas had napped with the deer, where they could watch over the land they'd loved. After the funerals, neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, offering help and hollow comfort. But Eli couldn't bear their pitying looks or their talk of God's plan and better places. He sold the cattle, gave away Sarah's belongings to women who needed them, and packed what little he could carry. On a grey November morning, he nailed boards over the windows of the cabin he'd built with such hope, tied Sarah's wedding ring on a leather cord around his neck, and walked into the mountains. He told himself he was going hunting, just needed to clear his head. But his feet kept climbing higher past the tree line, past the places where other men ventured. He found an old trapper's cabin near a hidden lake, 3 hard days from the nearest road, and decided it would do. If the world wanted to take everything he loved, then he'd remove himself from the world. 20 years passed, like seasons changing outside a window. Eli learned to speak to ravens in their own tongue, to read weather in the way pine needles moved, to find his way by stars his grandfather had shown him as a boy. He trapped just enough to trade for supplies, grew a garden in the brief mountain summer, and spent long winter nights reading the books Sarah had loved, hearing her voice in every poem. His cabin became a place where time moved differently. He marked years by the first snow and the first thaw, by the return of migrating birds and the bloom of Indian paintbrush. His hands grew rough again, his beard went grey, and his body settled into the rhythm of a life measured by necessity rather than ambition. He wore his grief like an old coat, familiar, comfortable, and impossible to take off. The ravens were his closest companions, 3 generations of them who came to know his routine. He'd share his breakfast with them and listen to their stories about the wider world. Tales of fires and storms, of strange men in the lower valleys, of changes he was glad not to witness. Sometimes deer would graze near his cabin while he worked, unafraid of the man who moved like part of the landscape. On quiet nights, usually when the aurora danced green across the northern sky, Eli would take out the photograph of his family and remember their voices. He'd tell them about his day, about the young bear he'd helped free from a deadfall trap, about the way morning light turned the lake into molten silver. Sometimes he imagined he heard them answer, felt their presence in the whisper of wind through the pines. He kept Sarah's recipe book, though he'd never been much of a cook. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes about which herbs helped with fever, which teas eased a cough, which roots could draw poison from a wound. Knowledge passed down from her grandmother, who'd learned from native women who understood the mountain's medicine. Eli studied those pages like scripture, learning to read the forest's pharmacy in case he ever needed to heal something besides his own broken heart. The morning he found the wolf, Eli had been checking snares along the ridge above Crater Lake. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and the world wore that pristine silence that comes only in the high country. He was following rabbit tracks when he heard it, a sound barely louder than breathing, but wrong somehow. Like pain trying to stay quiet, the wolf was hanging from a rocky outcrop about 15 feet below the trail, one front paw caught in a crevice, hindquarters dangling over empty air. How it had ended up there was anybody's guess. Chasing prey over the edge, maybe, or fleeing from something that scared it more than a deadly fall. Its golden eyes met Eli's with an intelligence that made his chest tighten. Not the desperate panic of a trapped animal, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. Most men would have kept walking. Wild wolves were dangerous on their best days, and cornered ones could kill a man before he knew what hit him. But something in those eyes reminded Eli of Thomas, of the way his son had looked at injured creatures with such pure compassion that Eli had to help, had to try. Getting down to the wolf meant rappelling on a rope he'd brought for hauling firewood, trusting his weight to an anchor that might not hold. The wolf watched him descend without struggling, as if it understood that fighting would only make things worse. When Eli reached the ledge, the creature's breathing was shallow, its fur matted with blood from where it had scraped against the rock. "Easy now," Eli murmured, the first words he'd spoken aloud in weeks. "Let's see what we can do." The wolf's paw was wedged deep in the crevice, swollen from hours of hanging. Eli had to work carefully, using his knife to chip away stone, while the wolf remained perfectly still. When the paw finally came free, the creature whimpered once, a sound so quietly brave it made Eli's throat close up. Getting them both back to the top took every bit of strength and skill Eli had left. The wolf was dead weight in his arms, consciousness fading as shock took hold. By the time he'd hauled them over the rim, his hands were scraped raw, and his heart was hammering like a young man's. He carried the wolf to his cabin, wrapped in his own coat, feeling its shallow breathing against his chest. It was a big animal, probably weighing near 80 pounds, with fur the color of autumn grass and those remarkable golden eyes. A male, young but full-grown, built for the kind of life that didn't usually end with rescue by lonely hermits. Eli laid the wolf on a bed of old blankets near his wood stove and began the careful work of healing. The injured paw was badly swollen, but not broken, and the scrapes would heal if infection didn't set in. He cleaned the wounds with water boiled with Sarah's medicinal herbs, wrapped the paw in strips torn from a clean shirt, and dripped broth between the wolf's teeth with a wooden spoon. For 3 days, the wolf drifted between sleep and waking, while Eli tended him with the patience he'd once used on his sick children. He changed bandages, forced water and broth, and kept the cabin warm enough for healing. On the 4th morning, he woke to find golden eyes watching him from across the room, alert and considering. They regarded each other in silence, man and wolf, each taking the measure of the other. Then the wolf lifted its head and made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that sounded remarkably like gratitude. "You're welcome," Eli said, and meant it. The wolf recovered faster than any wild creature had a right to. But what truly unsettled Eli was how the animal seemed to understand things no wolf should know. It started small, the way the wolf would position itself between Eli and the door whenever he worked near the stove, as if standing guard. How it would cock its head when Eli spoke, not just listening to tone, but appearing to process the actual words. Most wolves avoided human scent like poison, yet this one seemed drawn to the few belongings Eli had kept from his old life. On the 5th day after the rescue, Eli was mending a torn shirt when he noticed the wolf sitting perfectly still, staring at something on the shelf above his bunk. Following its gaze, Eli's breath caught. The wolf was looking directly at Sarah's hand-carved wooden cross, the one she'd made during her pregnancy, when her hands needed something to do during those long winter evenings. "You see that, do you?" Eli said softly. The wolf's ears twitched forward, and it made that same almost grateful sound from before. That night, Eli dreamed of Sarah for the first time in months. Not the fevered, dying Sarah from his nightmares, but the young woman who'd sung lullabies while hanging laundry on the line. In the dream, she was standing in their old garden, but she wasn't alone. Thomas was there too, older than when he died, maybe 8 or 9, and he was petting a golden wolf that looked remarkably familiar. "He's been waiting for you, Daddy," Dream Thomas said, his voice carrying that same gentle wisdom he'd had even as a small boy. "I told him you'd take care of him." Eli woke with tears on his cheeks, and the wolf watching him from across the room, those golden eyes reflecting the dying embers in the stove. 2 weeks later, the wolf proved it was more than just an unusually intelligent animal. Eli was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the crack, that sharp sound rock makes when it's about to give way. Years of mountain living had taught him to recognize danger, and he looked up to see a section of the cliff face above his woodpile beginning to separate from the main ledge. Before he could move, the wolf slammed into his legs, knocking him sideways just as a boulder the size of a cookstove crashed exactly where he'd been standing. The rock slide that followed buried his chopping block and scattered his split wood across 20 yards of mountainside. Eli sat in the snow, heart hammering, staring at the destruction. Then he looked at the wolf, who was watching him with what could only be described as satisfaction. "How did you know?" he whispered. The wolf tilted its head and made a sound that was almost like a chuckle. That evening, as Eli cooked dinner over his rebuilt fire pit, he found himself talking to the wolf the way he'd once talked to Sarah while she worked in her garden. He told it about his day, about the weather signs he'd noticed, about the raven who'd brought him a shiny button that morning as payment for shared bacon. "I used to talk to myself more," he admitted, stirring beans in his cast-iron pot. "But talking to you feels different. Feels like you're actually listening." The wolf was lying near the fire, injured paw stretched out to the warmth, but its ears were pricked forward in a way that suggested complete attention. "Sarah used to say, some animals had old souls," Eli continued. "Said they'd lived before, maybe as people, and they came back to finish something important." He paused, studying the wolf's intelligent face. "You ever hear anything that foolish?" The wolf made a soft sound and laid its chin on its good paw, but its eyes never left Eli's face. The dreams came more frequently after that. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes Thomas and Anna together, always peaceful, always in places touched by golden light. And always, somewhere in the dream, there was a wolf watching over them with familiar eyes. But the dreams weren't the only thing changing. 3 weeks after the rescue, Eli heard voices carrying up from the valley below, human voices, rough and careless, cutting through the mountain silence like axes through living wood. He'd heard occasional hunters over the years, but they usually respected the high country's dangers and kept to the lower trails. These men were different. From his ridge, Eli could see them through his old field glasses, 4 men in expensive camouflage, carrying gear that cost more than most folks made in a month. They'd set up a base camp near Willow Creek, not far from where Eli used to take Sarah for picnics, and they were acting like they owned the place. The wolf's reaction was immediate and fierce. The moment it caught their scent on the wind, its hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in its chest. Not the warning growl of a territorial animal, but something deeper, the sound of a creature recognizing an enemy. "You don't like them either, do you?" Eli murmured, scratching behind the wolf's ears. The animal leaned into his touch, but kept its eyes fixed on the valley below. Over the next few days, Eli watched the hunters through his glasses and grew increasingly uneasy. They weren't hunting for meat or even trophies. They were laying snares and setting spring traps, the kind that caught anything unlucky enough to step on them. Worse, they were targeting animals that weren't even in season. Eli saw them drag a young elk to their camp, its neck broken by a wire snare, and leave most of the meat to rot while they took only the antlers. The wolf watched with him, and Eli could swear he saw disgust in those golden eyes. "That's not hunting," he told his companion. "That's just killing for the pleasure of it." Sarah had taught him the difference between taking what you needed and taking what you wanted. The mountain provided, but it demanded respect in return. These men showed no respect for anything, not for the animals they killed wastefully, not for the land they trampled, not for the silence they shattered with their loud voices and careless laughter. On the 4th night, Eli was jolted awake by the wolf's urgent whining. The animal was standing at the cabin door, every muscle tense, ears flat against its head. When Eli opened the door, the smell hit him immediately. Smoke, but not the clean scent of a campfire. This was the acrid stench of burning plastic and rubber. From his porch, he could see the glow flickering in the valley. The hunters had built their fire too big and too close to the dry brush. And now it was spreading toward the old-growth forest, where Eli had proposed to Sarah 30 years ago. The wolf looked up at him, then back toward the fire, and Eli heard Thomas's voice as clearly as if his son were standing beside him. "Some things are worth fighting for. Daddy, for 20 years, Eli had avoided the world of men, content to let it spin on without him. But watching those flames creep toward trees that had stood for centuries, he felt something stir in his chest that had been sleeping since the fever took his family. Sarah had made him promise to live, really live, not just survive. Maybe protecting the mountain she'd loved was part of keeping that promise. The wolf seemed to sense his thoughts. It moved closer, pressing against his leg, and made a sound that was unmistakably encouragement. "All right," Eli said quietly. "All right, then." He gathered his firefighting tools, shovel, axe, and buckets, while the wolf watched with approval. As they headed down the mountain toward the growing blaze, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what was supposed to happen. The wolf hadn't stumbled into his life by accident, and neither had these careless men who threatened everything he'd spent 20 years protecting. "Some meetings were written in the stars," Sarah used to say. "Some battles chose you, rather than the other way around." The wolf trotted beside him through the darkness, and for the first time since he'd buried his family, Eli Boone wasn't walking alone. They fought the fire until dawn, Eli and his unlikely partner working in silent coordination that should have been impossible between man and wild animal. The wolf seemed to understand exactly what was needed, fetching tools when Eli dropped them, alerting him to wind shifts that could spread the flames, even helping to herd frightened deer away from the danger. By sunrise, they'd contained the blaze to a few acres of scrubland, but the damage to Eli's peace of mind was far more extensive. As he sat on a blackened stump, soot-covered and exhausted, watching the hunters break camp without so much as checking on the fire they'd caused, something fundamental shifted inside him. For 20 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was protection, that if he stayed far enough from other people, they couldn't hurt him again. But watching those men drive away in their expensive trucks, leaving destruction in their wake, he realized some hurts came, whether you hid from them or not. The wolf sat beside him, panting slightly, its golden fur now streaked with ash. When it looked at him, Eli saw something in those eyes that made his chest tighten, approval maybe, or recognition, as if the animal had been waiting for him to remember who he used to be. "Sarah always said I was a protector at heart," he told the wolf, surprised to hear his own voice so hoarse with more than just smoke. "Said that's why she fell in love with me, not because I was the strongest or the smartest, but because I'd stand between her and anything that meant her harm." The wolf made that almost purring sound and pressed closer against his leg. Back at the cabin, Eli dug out his old leather journal from the bottom of his trunk. He hadn't written in it since the first year after Sarah's death, when grief had made every thought feel too heavy to carry alone. The pages were yellowed now, filled with entries that tracked his descent from hope to mere survival. March 15th, 1986. Snow melting early this year. Sarah would have loved to see the wildflowers coming up through the last drifts. June 2nd, 1987. Fixed the roof leak. Getting good at talking to myself. October 18th, 1989. Ravens brought me a shiny rock today. Starting to understand their language, I think. Then nothing for years, just blank pages that marked time passing without purpose. But now, with the wolf watching from its place by the fire, Eli picked up his pencil and began to write. April 3rd, 2006. Pulled a wolf from a cliff 3 weeks ago. Should have been the end of it, but I think it might be the beginning of something else. The animal shows intelligence I've never seen in a wild creature. Today we fought a fire together, and I swear it understood exactly what needed doing. Sarah used to say some souls come back to finish unfinished business. Starting to wonder if she was right about more than I gave her credit for. Over the following days, the wolf's behavior grew even more remarkable. It would position itself at the cabin's single window each morning before Eli woke, watching the trails that led up from the valley. When Eli asked what it was looking for, the wolf would tilt its head toward the south, exactly where the hunter's camp had been. "You think they'll be back?" Eli said. It wasn't a question. The wolf's low growl was answer enough. Eli found himself remembering things he'd thought he'd forgotten. The way Thomas used to claim he could talk to animals. How the boy would spend hours in serious conversation with their old farm dog, Boomer. Sarah had encouraged it, saying children often understood things adults had learned to dismiss. "Animals know things we don't," she'd told Eli once, watching Thomas share his lunch with a family of raccoons. "They see the world without all our complicated thoughts getting in the way." Now, watching his wolf companion, Eli began to understand what she'd meant. The animal didn't just react to its environment, it seemed to anticipate it. When weather was changing, the wolf would move to shelter hours before the first clouds appeared. When Eli was running low on firewood, the wolf would lead him to deadfalls he hadn't noticed. Most unsettling of all, when Eli spoke Sarah's name or mentioned the children, the wolf's attention would sharpen as if it recognized the words. The dreams were changing too. Sarah appeared more frequently now, not as the grieving woman from his memories, but as the vibrant girl he'd fallen in love with. In the dreams, she would smile and say things like, "He's been looking for you for such a long time," or "Some love is stronger than death." Eli. Then the hunters returned. Eli spotted them through his field glasses on a grey Tuesday morning, the same 4 men, but this time with additional vehicles and what looked like professional equipment. They'd set up their camp in a different location, higher up the valley, closer to the protected wilderness area where hunting was strictly forbidden. The wolf's reaction was immediate and alarming. It began pacing the cabin's perimeter, hackles raised, making sounds Eli had never heard before. Not quite howls, not quite growls, but something that spoke of danger and determination. "Easy," Eli murmured. But the wolf ignored him, continuing its restless patrol. Through his glasses, Eli watched the men unload gear that had nothing to do with legitimate hunting. Electronic calls designed to lure animals, high-powered scopes meant for long-distance killing, and worst of all, cages. Dozens of wire cages in various sizes. These weren't hunters. They were poachers, and from the look of their operation, they were planning to trap live animals for illegal sale. That evening, as Eli sat by his fire trying to process what he'd seen, the wolf suddenly went rigid. Its ears pricked forward, and it made a sound like a warning whistle. Moments later, Eli heard what had caught the animal's attention. Voices, human voices, coming up the trail toward his cabin. "You sure this is the right way, Jake?" One voice called out, "GPS says the old hermit's place is just ahead," came the reply. "Figure we ought to let him know we're working the area. Don't want any trouble with the locals." Eli's blood ran cold. Somehow, they'd learned about him, learned about his cabin. In 20 years, he'd managed to stay invisible to the outside world, but these men had found him in a matter of days. The wolf moved to stand between Eli and the door, every muscle tensed for action. In the firelight, its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was becoming harder and harder to explain as mere animal instinct. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path outside, and then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that shattered the evening quiet like gunshots. "Hello in there," called the voice Eli now knew belonged to Jake. "We're just neighbors, looking to have a friendly conversation." Eli looked down at the wolf, whose lips were pulled back in a silent snarl. In that moment, he made a decision that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. He was done running from the world. If these men wanted trouble, they'd found the right place for it. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of trouble they represented. Eli opened the door just wide enough to see the men on his porch. 4 of them, as he'd expected, but up close, they looked even more dangerous than they had through his field glasses. The one in front, Jake, was built like a man who settled arguments with his fists, while his companions had the careful, watchful eyes of people who made their living outside the law. "Evening," Jake said, showing teeth in what was supposed to be a smile. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we heard there was somebody living up here. and we wanted to introduce ourselves. The wolf remained hidden behind the partially open door, but Eli could feel its tension like electricity in the air. He kept his own voice steady, projecting the kind of calm wariness that came from 20 years of mountain living. "Not many folks find their way up here," Eli said. "Takes some effort to locate this place." "Well, we're persistent types," Jake replied, his eyes trying to peer past Eli into the cabin. "We're doing some hunting in the area, all legal and above board, of course, and we thought it'd be neighborly to let you know. Don't want any misunderstandings." Behind Eli, the wolf made the softest possible growl, a sound only he could hear, warning, danger. These men were lying, and somehow the animal knew it. "I appreciate the courtesy," Eli said, "but I keep to myself up here. Don't expect our paths will cross much." Jake's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Funny thing about paths in the mountains, they all seem to connect eventually. Mind if we come in? It's getting cold out here, and we've got some questions about the area. Local knowledge, you understand." "I'm afraid I was just turning in for the night," Eli replied. "Been a long day." For a moment the silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tension. Then Jake nodded, that false smile still plastered on his face. "Of course. Well, maybe we'll catch up again soon. We'll be working this area for the next few weeks." As the men walked away, Eli caught fragments of their conversation. Definitely knows more than he's saying. "Been up here 20 years. According to the county records, might be a problem if he starts asking questions." Eli closed and barred the door, then sat heavily in his chair by the fire. The wolf emerged from its hiding place and came to sit beside him, resting its head on his knee. When Eli looked into those golden eyes, he saw an expression that was unmistakably protective. "They're not hunters, are they?" he said quietly. The wolf made a sound that was clearly agreement. Over the next few days, Eli began to piece together what the men were really doing in his mountains. Using skills he'd learned as a young man tracking game, he followed their movements from a distance, always with the wolf as his silent companion. What he discovered made his stomach turn. They'd set up a sophisticated poaching operation, targeting rare and protected species for an illegal wildlife trade that stretched far beyond the Sierra Nevada. Eli found their trap lines, dozens of snares designed to capture rather than kill, cages hidden in remote locations, and a staging area where they processed their captives before transport. The wolf led him to the worst of it. A hidden compound where they kept live animals in cramped cages, waiting for buyers. Eli saw golden eagles, mountain lions, and even a young grizzly bear, all destined for private collectors who paid premium prices for creatures that couldn't legally be owned. But it was the photograph that made everything personal. Tucked inside his shirt pocket, Eli carried the only picture he'd kept from his old life, a faded family photograph taken the summer before the fever. Sarah sat in the middle, holding baby Anna, while Thomas leaned against Eli's shoulder, grinning at the camera. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood the old oak tree where they'd buried the children. The wolf had discovered the photograph weeks ago, drawn to it with an intensity that had puzzled Eli at the time. Now, as they crouched in the underbrush, watching the poachers tend their stolen animals, the wolf kept nudging the pocket where the picture rested. When Eli pulled it out to look at it again, the wolf pressed close, studying the image with those eerily intelligent eyes. Then it did something that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. It touched the photograph with its nose, directly over Thomas's smiling face. "Thomas loved animals," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. "Always said they had souls, just like people." The wolf looked up at him, and in that moment, Eli saw something in those golden eyes that he'd been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. Recognition, love, the same gentle intelligence that had looked out from his son's eyes 20 years ago. It was impossible. It was crazy, but as the wolf pressed closer against him, Eli felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the fever took his family. For the first time in 2 decades, he wasn't alone. That night, back at the cabin, Eli made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a month before. He was going to stop the poachers, not because the law required it. The law had never ventured this far into the high country, but because some things were worth fighting for. Regardless of the cost, Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. Some battles choose you. Eli, the question isn't whether you're brave enough to fight them, but whether you're brave enough to recognize when they've chosen you. The wolf seemed to sense his resolve. It sat up straighter, ears pricked forward, as if waiting for orders from a commander it trusted completely. "All right," Eli said aloud, scratching behind the wolf's ears. "But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. No unnecessary killing, no revenge for its own sake. We stop them, we save the animals, and we make sure they can't come back." The wolf made that soft, approving sound and laid its head on Eli's boots, a gesture of loyalty that felt like a promise. Outside the cabin, the mountain wind carried the scent of coming snow and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, a man who'd thought he'd lost everything was beginning to understand that sometimes what we lose comes back to us in forms we never expected. The battle for the mountain was about to begin, and Eli Boone wouldn't be fighting it alone. The first thing Eli did was try to contact the authorities, though 20 years of mountain living had taught him not to expect much from the outside world. His old shortwave radio crackled to life after some coaxing, and he managed to raise the county sheriff's office on a frequency he remembered from his younger days. "This is Eli Boone, calling from the high country above Willow Creek," he said into the microphone, feeling strange, hearing his own voice transmitted beyond the mountain peaks. "I need to report illegal poaching activity in the protected wilderness area." The response came back distorted by static and distance. "Mr. Boone, this is Deputy Martinez. Can you provide more specific information about the location and nature of the alleged activity?" For the next 20 minutes, Eli described what he'd seen. The trap lines, the caged animals, the sophisticated operation that clearly involved significant financial backing. The wolf sat beside him throughout the conversation, head tilted as if it too were listening to the tinny voice coming through the radio speaker. "We'll look into it, Mr. Boone," Martinez finally replied. "But I have to tell you, we've had reports about this group before. Every time we send someone up to investigate, they're gone by the time we arrive. They seem to have advance warning somehow. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Someone in the sheriff's office was feeding information to the poachers, probably in exchange for a cut of their profits." Eli thanked the deputy and signed off, but he could see in the wolf's knowing eyes that they both understood the truth. They were truly on their own. That afternoon, while scouting the poachers' operation from a concealed position, the wolf led Eli to something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a rockfall near the old mining claims, partially concealed by decades of pine needles and weathering, was a cache of military surplus equipment. The crates were stamped with dates from the 1980s and bore the faded markings of various government agencies. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and plastic, Eli found weapons, ammunition, field gear, and communications equipment, enough to outfit a small unit for extended operations in hostile territory. A tattered journal, bound in waterproof cover, lay on top of the largest crate. The first entry was dated September 15, 1987. "My name is Colonel James Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Forces, retired. If someone is reading this, it means I didn't make it down from the mountain, but my work here isn't finished. For 3 years, I've been tracking an illegal wildlife trafficking network that reaches from these mountains to buyers in Asia and the Middle East. The local authorities are compromised, bought and paid for by people with more money than conscience. I came up here after my wife died, thinking I was done with fighting other people's wars. But some wars follow you home, and some battles choose their own warriors. These mountains are sacred ground, Shoshone burial sites, pristine wilderness that's been protected for good reason. I won't let it be destroyed by greedy men who think everything has a price. If you found this cache, it's because you've seen what I saw, felt what I felt. The mountain has a way of calling the right people to its defense. Use what's here wisely. Fight smart, not hard. And remember, sometimes the best weapon is knowing when not to use one. The journal chronicled 3 years of solitary warfare against successive waves of poachers and illegal loggers. Mitchell had studied their patterns, disrupted their operations, and gradually driven them away through a combination of tactical superiority and psychological pressure. But the final entries told a different story. March 2nd, 1990. They've brought in professionals this time. Military contractors, by the look of their gear and movements. This isn't about wildlife anymore. They're clearing the area for something bigger. Found survey stakes and soil samples near the old uranium claims. God help us all. March 15th, 1990. They know I'm here. Set an ambush today that I barely escaped. Time to make my final stand. If they want this mountain, they'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands. Sarah, if there's an afterlife, save me a place by the fire. The journal ended there, but the wolf led Eli to a small grave marked with a simple stone cairn, hidden in a grove of ancient pines. Someone, Mitchell himself probably in his final moments, had carved a simple inscription. Colonel James Mitchell, 1932-1990. He held the line. Eli knelt beside the grave while the wolf sat quietly nearby, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt connected to something larger than his own grief. Mitchell had been like him, a man who'd lost everything and retreated to the mountains, only to find that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned. He was a guardian, Eli told the wolf, who made that soft sound of understanding. Just like you're trying to make me into. That evening, as Eli cleaned and inventoried Mitchell's equipment, he found something that made his hands shake. At the bottom of the weapon cache, wrapped in Sarah's old baby blanket, the one he thought he'd lost years ago, was a compass. Not just any compass, but the same military-grade instrument his father had carried in Korea, the one Eli had given to Thomas on the boy's 8th birthday. The wolf watched as Eli turned the compass over in his hands, reading the inscription he'd had engraved on the back. To Tommy, my brave explorer, may you always find your way home. Love, Dad, how did this get here? Eli whispered, but even as he asked the question, he thought he knew the answer. Thomas had been carrying the compass the day he died, clutching it against his chest as the fever burned through his small body. Eli had buried it with his son, placing it in the boy's hands for the long journey ahead. The wolf moved closer, pressing its warm body against Eli's leg, and suddenly the mountain evening felt charged with possibility and presence. Sarah had always said love didn't end with death. It just changed shape, found new ways to reach across the veil between worlds. Maybe his son had found a way to guide his father after all. Maybe the wolf with the golden eyes and the impossible intelligence was more than just a rescued animal. Maybe some spirits were strong enough to take new forms when their loved ones needed them most. The compass needle swung true north, just as it always had, just as Thomas would have wanted. And in that moment, surrounded by a dead soldier's weapons and his son's favorite toy, Eli Boone finally understood why he'd been chosen for this fight. Some battles were about more than winning or losing. Some battles were about proving that love could outlast death, that duty could survive loss, and that even broken men could find the strength to protect what mattered most. The poachers had picked the wrong mountain to desecrate, and they'd threatened the wrong man's family. Now they would learn what it meant to face a father's love, armed with a soldier's tools, and guided by a spirit that refused to let go. The poisoning started 3 days later, and it nearly killed them both. Eli first noticed something was wrong when the wolf refused to drink from the stream that ran past his cabin, the same crystal-clear water they'd shared for weeks without problem. The animal would approach the creek, lower its head as if to drink, then back away with a whine of distress. "What's got into you?" Eli asked, but when he knelt to examine the water himself, he saw nothing obviously wrong. It ran clear and cold as always, tumbling down from the high peaks where snowmelt fed the underground springs. The wolf paced nervously, making sounds that were almost like words. urgent. Worried sounds that spoke of danger Eli couldn't see. When he reached for his water bucket to fill it from the stream, the wolf actually grabbed his sleeve with its teeth, pulling him back from the water's edge. That's when Eli knew to trust the animal's instincts over his own eyes. He hiked upstream for nearly an hour, following the creek toward its source, with the wolf ranging ahead like a scout. What they found made Eli's blood run cold. Someone had dumped industrial chemicals into the watershed, barrels of what looked like pesticide or herbicide, deliberately poured into the stream system that fed half the mountain's wildlife. The wolf stood at the edge of the contamination zone, hackles raised, making that deep growling sound that meant immediate danger. Dead fish floated in the poison pools, and the vegetation along the banks was already showing signs of chemical burn. But it was more than just environmental destruction. This was a deliberate attempt to drive Eli away from the mountain, to poison the water sources he depended on for survival. The poachers had escalated from intimidation to attempted murder, and they'd done it in a way that would kill everything else in the watershed as collateral damage. Eli's hands shook as he collected water samples in glass jars, evidence of a crime that would be difficult to prove and impossible to undo. 20 years of careful stewardship destroyed in a single night by men who saw the mountain as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The wolf seemed to sense his despair. It pressed close against his legs, making soft sounds of comfort, and for a moment Eli felt the presence of his son so strongly it took his breath away. Thomas had always been the one to comfort others when they were hurting, offering hugs and gentle words that seemed wise beyond his years. "They want to make this personal," Eli told the wolf as they made their way back to the cabin. "Fine, let's make it personal." That night, Eli spread Colonel Mitchell's tactical maps across his kitchen table and began planning his response. The wolf lay beside him, occasionally looking up at the maps as if it understood the symbols and terrain markers, which, given everything else the animal seemed to comprehend, might not have been impossible. Mitchell's journal provided a blueprint for psychological warfare adapted to mountain conditions. The key wasn't to confront the poachers directly. They had superior numbers and firepower, but to make them feel constantly watched, constantly threatened, until their nerves broke and they made mistakes. Eli started small, using skills he'd learned from his grandfather's hunting stories and refined through decades of mountain living. He began leaving signs of his presence around the poachers' camp, footprints that appeared overnight in places no one should have been able to reach, equipment that mysteriously moved from one location to another, food supplies that disappeared without a trace. The wolf proved to be an invaluable partner in these operations. It could move through the forest like a ghost, leaving no trail even Eli could follow, and it seemed to take genuine pleasure in the work of harassment. More than once, Eli watched through his field glasses as the animal circled the poachers' camp just outside the range of their lights, its golden eyes reflecting their campfire like twin flames in the darkness. After a week of such treatment, the poachers were jumpy and paranoid, arguing among themselves and jumping at shadows. Eli heard their conversations through a directional microphone he'd found in Mitchell's equipment cache. "I'm telling you, there's something out there watching us," one voice insisted. "Bill saw those eyes again last night, same as Tuesday." "It's just a coyote or something," Jake replied, but his voice carried less conviction than his words. "Mountains full of wild animals. Coyotes don't move equipment around camp," another voice interjected. "And they sure as hell don't know how to untie knots." "Someone's been messing with our gear." "The old hermit," Jake said. "Has to be. Man's been up here 20 years, probably knows every rock and tree on this mountain. So what do we do? We've got buyers coming next week, and half our inventory is getting spooked by all this weirdness." There was a long pause before Jake answered. "We finished the job. All of it. The old man's become a liability." Eli felt the wolf stiffen beside him as they listened to the conversation. The animal seemed to understand exactly what the men were planning, and its low growl spoke of protective fury that was entirely human in its intensity. That night, as Eli cleaned Mitchell's rifle and checked the loads in his revolver. The wolf brought him something he hadn't seen in years, the compass that had belonged to Thomas, the one they'd found in Mitchell's cache. The animal dropped it at Eli's feet and made a sound that was unmistakably encouragement. "You want me to fight them," Eli said. It wasn't a question. The wolf made that soft, affirmative sound and touched its nose to the compass. Eli picked up the instrument and watched its needle swing true north, just as it had when Thomas carried it on their hunting trips and nature walks, just as it had when he'd placed it in his son's hands for the last time. "Your mama made me promise to live," he told the wolf, who was almost certainly listening with more than animal ears. "But living doesn't mean hiding. Sometimes it means standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you." The wolf moved closer, resting its head on Eli's knee, and in that gesture he felt all the love and trust a father could ask for from his child. Outside the cabin, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow and the distant howl of other wolves, wild creatures who still ran free because men like Mitchell and Eli were willing to fight for their freedom. The poachers wanted a war. They were about to get one, led by a grieving father, a dead soldier's ghost, and a wolf with golden eyes who remembered what it meant to love someone enough to die for them. But first, Eli had one more call to make on his shortwave radio, not to the compromised authorities, but to the one person who might still be willing to listen to an old man's warning about the storm that was coming. The discovery came when Eli was searching through the last of his belongings for anything that might help in the coming fight. Deep in his old trunk, beneath layers of Sarah's quilts and his father's war medals, his fingers closed around something he'd forgotten he'd kept. A small wooden wolf, carved with the careful attention to detail that only a child's love could inspire. Thomas had made it the summer before the fever, spending weeks with Eli's pocket knife and a piece of seasoned pine, working on it during quiet evenings when Sarah read to the family from her book of fairy tales. The boy had been so proud of his creation, painting the tiny wolf's eyes with Sarah's watercolors until they gleamed like captured sunlight. "It's for you, Daddy," Thomas had said, pressing the wooden figure into Eli's hands. "So you'll always have a wolf friend to protect you, even when I'm not here." Eli's hands trembled as he held the carving now, 20 years later, remembering how he'd ruffled his son's hair and promised to treasure it always. After the fever took the children, he'd packed it away with all the other memories that hurt too much to bear, telling himself he'd look at it again someday when the grief didn't feel like drowning. But it wasn't just the carved wolf that made his breath catch. It was what he found tucked behind it in the trunk's corner. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in Thomas's careful 8-year-old handwriting. The letter was addressed to Daddy in crayon letters that wandered across the page like a mountain stream. "Dear Daddy, Mama says I might not get better from the fever, so I wanted to write you a letter about the wolf dreams I've been having. Every night, a big golden wolf comes to visit me, and he tells me things about taking care of you when you're sad. The wolf says his name is Guardian, and he's been waiting for a long time to help our family. He says that love doesn't stop when people go to heaven, it just finds new ways to keep working. He says if I have to go away, he'll stay with you and make sure you're not alone. I know you might think it's just fever dreams, but the wolf feels real when I talk to him. He knows about the mountain where you want to build our new cabin, and he knows about the men who try to hurt animals just because they can. He says those men will come to the mountain someday, and when they do, you'll need a friend to help you protect everything we love. Don't be sad, Daddy. The wolf promised me that family love is stronger than anything, even death. He says he'll find a way to come back to you when you need him most. And you'll know it's him because he'll have golden eyes like the sunlight Mama loves so much. I love you and Mama and Anna more than all the stars in the sky. Take care of yourself until we can all be together again. Your son, Thomas P.S. The wolf says to tell you that when you see him, you should trust your heart instead of your head, because hearts know things that heads haven't learned yet. Eli's vision blurred as he read the letter, Sarah's voice echoing in his memory. Thomas has been having the strangest dreams about wolves. Says they're trying to tell him something important. At the time, they dismissed it as childhood imagination amplified by fever. But now, sitting in his mountain cabin with a golden-eyed wolf watching him with impossible intelligence, Eli felt the world shift beneath him, like an avalanche finding its slope. The wolf, his wolf. The creature he'd pulled from the cliff and nursed back to health moved closer, pressing its warm body against his legs. When Eli looked down into those familiar golden eyes, he saw recognition there, and love, and something that could only be called patience. "Tommy?" he whispered, his voice breaking on the name he hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. The wolf made a sound unlike any it had made before, a soft, almost human sound of joy and relief, like a child who'd been waiting too long for his father to come home. It placed its head in Eli's lap and closed its eyes, finally able to rest after carrying out a promise that had taken 2 decades to fulfill. The truth hit Eli like lightning striking the mountain peaks. Every impossible moment of intelligence, every uncanny act of protection, every time the wolf had seemed to understand things no animal should know, it all made sense now. His son had found a way to keep his promise, had somehow crossed the impossible distance between death and life, to stand guard over the father he'd never stopped loving. "How long have you been waiting?" Eli asked, stroking the wolf's familiar golden fur. The animal, Thomas, looked up at him with eyes that held 20 years of patient love, and answered with a sound that was unmistakably, "As long as it took." Suddenly, all the pieces fell into place. The wolf's protective instincts weren't just animal behavior, they were a son's determination to shield his father from harm. The creature's intelligence wasn't supernatural, it was a child's love expressing itself through a form that could survive in the mountain wilderness. The way the wolf had led him to Colonel Mitchell's cache, the way it had warned him about the poisoned water, the way it seemed to understand every word of their conversations. It was Thomas, grown wise in whatever realm spirits inhabited, using every tool available to guide his father toward the destiny that awaited them both. "The men who are coming," Eli said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise, breaking over the peaks. "This is what you've been preparing me for, isn't it? This is why you came back." The wolf's tail moved once, a single deliberate wag that was pure Thomas, the boy who'd always been sparing with his gestures but absolute in his affections. Say felt something break open in his chest. 20 years of grief and guilt and loneliness cracking like ice in spring. His son was here, had always been here, waiting for the moment when faith would be stronger than disbelief, when love would be more real than death. "I've missed you," he whispered. And the wolf pressed closer, making sounds of comfort that were heartbreakingly familiar. How many times had Thomas done exactly this when his father was troubled, offering silent support until the storm passed? That night, as Eli sat by his fire with the wolf curled at his feet, he finally understood the true nature of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about stopping poachers or protecting wildlife. It was about a father and son working together to defend something sacred, something that represented all the love and beauty they'd shared during their brief time as a family. The golden eyes that watched him from across the flames belonged to his boy, his Thomas, who'd found a way to honor the promise he'd made in a fever dream 20 years ago. Guardian he'd called himself in the letter, the wolf who would protect Daddy when times got dark. Sarah had been right about so many things. Love didn't end with death, it just changed shape. Some souls were strong enough to cross between worlds when their loved ones needed them most. And sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as ordinary moments of grace, like a man rescuing a wolf from a cliff, never knowing he was actually being rescued himself. Tomorrow, the final battle would begin. But tonight, for the first time since he'd buried his family, Eli Boone wasn't alone. His son was with him, would always be with him, ready to face whatever came next with the same brave heart that had carried them both through 20 years of separation. The compass needle pointed true north, just as it always had, just as Thomas would always do. Some gifts transcended death, and some promises were too powerful for the grave to hold. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Eli and the wolf, Thomas, began their final preparations. The shortwave radio had brought news that changed everything. A government wildlife inspector was driving up from Sacramento, responding to the water contamination report Eli had filed through a friend of Colonel Mitchell's. A retired ranger who still had contacts in the federal system. Inspector Janet Chen will arrive at the Valley Road around noon, the tinny voice had reported. She's got authority to make arrests and shut down any illegal operations. Just keep your head down until she gets there. Mr. Boone. But keeping his head down had never been Eli's way, and it certainly wasn't Thomas's. The wolf paced restlessly around the cabin, making soft sounds that spoke of urgency and determination. Through their spiritual connection, Eli could feel his son's thoughts as clearly as if they were spoken aloud. The poachers would destroy all evidence and scatter before the inspector arrived, unless someone forced their hand. Sarah's recipe book lay open on the kitchen table, her careful handwriting providing a different kind of guidance than Colonel Mitchell's tactical manuals. Eli had been studying her notes about healing herbs and natural remedies, preparing for injuries that might come, but also finding wisdom in her gentle philosophy of conflict resolution. Use only what force is necessary, he read from a margin note she'd written beside a recipe for comfrey poultice. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from giving your enemy a chance to surrender with dignity. The wolf moved to stand beside him, looking down at Sarah's words with those knowing golden eyes. Even in his spiritual form, Thomas carried his mother's compassion alongside his father's protective instincts. She'd want us to give them a chance, Eli said, and the wolf made that soft sound of agreement. But first, they needed to gather evidence that would stand up in court, document the full scope of the poaching operation, and position themselves to prevent the criminals from escaping when the pressure mounted. It would require military precision combined with a father's love, exactly the combination that had been building between them for weeks. Eli loaded his pack with Mitchell's equipment: night vision scope, digital camera, portable GPS unit, and enough ammunition to fight a small war if peaceful methods failed. The wolf watched these preparations with approval, tail wagging once when Eli strapped on the knife Thomas had watched him use for decades of hunting and camping trips. "Remember," Eli told his son as they prepared to leave the cabin, "we're not trying to hurt anyone if we can help it. We're trying to save something precious, the mountain, the animals, and maybe even those men's souls, if they're willing to listen to reason." The wolf pressed against his leg in response, and Eli felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. This was what he'd been missing for 20 years. Not just Thomas's presence, but the sense of shared purpose that had made their family strong. They'd always been a team, he and his boy. Whether they were building tree houses or tracking deer through autumn woods, now they were tracking predators of a different kind. But the same principles applied: patience, preparation, and perfect timing. The poachers' main camp was located in a natural amphitheater below Granite Ridge, protected on 3 sides by steep rock walls, but accessible from the north through a narrow passage that would become a trap if properly controlled. Eli and Thomas positioned themselves on the high ground overlooking the camp, using Mitchell's night vision equipment to document the full scope of the illegal operation. What they saw made Eli's jaw clench with anger. The poachers had expanded their activities far beyond wildlife trafficking. Caged animals filled temporary shelters throughout the camp, not just local species, but creatures that had clearly been transported from other regions. Exotic birds, reptiles, and mammals were thousands of dollars each on the black market, but it was the newest addition to their inventory that made both Eli and the wolf stiffen with protective rage. In a reinforced pen near the center of camp, 3 wolf cubs played under the watchful eyes of their captured mother, a magnificent female with fur, like spun silver and eyes that held the same ancient wisdom. Eli had learned to recognize in his own companion. "They took her babies," Eli whispered, his voice tight with emotion. The wolf beside him made a sound like a growl and a whimper combined, the voice of someone who understood exactly what it meant to be separated from family. Through his field glasses, Eli watched the cubs tumble over each other in innocent play, while their mother paced the confines of her prison. The sight awakened every protective instinct he possessed, not just as a father, but as someone who'd learned to see the sacred in all forms of family love. "We're getting them out," he told Thomas. "All of them." The wolf's tail wagged once, emphatic agreement from a spirit who'd never forgotten the importance of keeping families together. Using techniques learned from Mitchell's journal, Eli began documenting everything: license plates, faces, equipment serial numbers, GPS coordinates of trap lines and holding areas. The digital camera captured image after image of evidence that would ensure conviction, even if some of the criminals escaped immediate capture. But as dawn approached, bringing Inspector Chen closer to the valley, the poacher's behavior grew increasingly agitated. Jake was shouting orders, his men working frantically to break down their operation ahead of schedule. "Load the high-value inventory first," Jake commanded. "We can replace the local stuff later. But those importers in Singapore won't. Wait for another shipment." Eli realized with growing alarm that the criminals planned to evacuate the most valuable animals, including the wolf family, before the federal inspector could arrive. Once those cages disappeared into the network of illegal wildlife trade, the creatures inside would never be seen again. The wolf pressed closer to Eli, making soft sounds of urgency that translated clearly. Time was running out. "I know," Eli murmured, studying the camp layout through his scope. "But if we move too early, they'll scatter and take the animals with them. If we wait too long, Inspector Chen arrives to find empty cages and no evidence." The solution came from an unexpected source, the memory of Thomas's voice from 20 years ago, asking why some animals chose to work together while others fought alone. "Wolves are pack hunters, Daddy," the boy had said, watching a nature documentary about Yellowstone. "They don't win because they're the biggest or strongest. They win because they understand that some victories can only be achieved together." Eli looked at his son, seeing both the wolf's intelligent eyes and the boy's gentle wisdom. "You're right. We need more than just the two of us for this." The wolf tilted its head, ears pricked forward in a question. "The other wolves," Eli explained, a plan taking shape in his mind. "The wild pack that lives in the high country. We call them, and we make this a fight the poachers can't win, not because we're stronger, but because we're fighting for something they'll never understand." Thomas had always been fascinated by wolf communication, spending hours trying to imitate their howls and yips. Now, in his spiritual form, he possessed abilities that transcended human limitations. The wolf threw back its head and released a sound that was both howl and song, a call that echoed off the granite peaks and carried for miles through the mountain air. The response came within minutes, answering voices from the ridges above, the valleys below, and the hidden places where wild things ran free. Not just wolves, but the entire community of mountain creatures who'd learned to trust the man who lived quietly among them and asked nothing except the right to belong. "Now we wait for Inspector Chen," Eli said, checking his watch, "and we make sure those animals are still here when she arrives." The wolf made a sound of satisfaction and settled into position for the watch ahead. Father and son, human and spirit, guardian and guardian, ready to fight the most important battle of their lives with the mountains themselves as their allies. The final confrontation was coming, and this time the wild things would not go quietly into captivity. The attack came at first light, just as Jake and his men were loading the most valuable animals into transport vehicles. Eli had positioned himself on the ridge overlooking their camp, Thomas beside him. both of them watching through the pre-dawn darkness as the poachers worked to erase all evidence of their crimes. "There," Eli whispered, pointing to a black SUV pulling up to the camp's main shelter. "That's their escape vehicle. Once those cages go in, we'll never see those animals again." The wolf's hackles rose as they watched two men drag the cage containing the mother wolf and her cubs toward the waiting vehicle. Even at this distance, they could hear the cubs' frightened whimpers and their mothers answering calls of comfort. Eli felt something, cold and hard, settle in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to work 18-hour days building his family's cabin, the same fierce love that had made him sit beside 3 sick beds for 6 days straight, willing his wife and children back to health through sheer determination. "Inspector Chen is still 40 minutes out," he told Thomas. "Those animals won't last 40 minutes. The wolf looked at him with golden eyes that held both question and certainty. "Are we doing this?" "We're doing this," Eli confirmed, checking the load in Mitchell's rifle. "But we do it smart. Disable their vehicles first, scatter their communications, then give them exactly one chance to surrender peacefully." Thomas made that soft sound of agreement and moved into position. Over the past weeks, Eli had learned to read his son's spiritual form like a book. The wolf was excited, focused, ready, but underneath the warrior's determination lay the same gentle heart that had made Thomas want to heal injured animals rather than hunt them. Eli's first shot took out the black SUV's front tire with a sound like thunder echoing off the canyon walls. Before the poachers could react, his second shot shattered their radio antenna, cutting off communication with the outside world. The response was immediate chaos. Men dove for cover behind vehicles and crates, shouting questions and curses into the dawn air. Jake's voice cut through the confusion. "It's the hermit. Find him and take him down." But Eli was no longer where their return fire was aimed. Using techniques learned from Colonel Mitchell's journal, he'd already moved to a secondary position 50 yards away. Invisible among the granite boulders that crowned the ridge, Thomas had vanished entirely, a golden shadow moving through the forest like smoke. The first sign of the wolf's presence came when one of the poachers screamed, not in pain, but in pure terror. The man had been trying to circle around to flank Eli's position when something big and fast had exploded from the underbrush, snarling with primal fury. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded, his voice carrying the edge of panic. "Wolf!" the terrified poacher shouted back. "Biggest damn wolf I ever saw. Came out of nowhere." Eli smiled grimly as he lined up his next shot. Thomas was doing exactly what they'd planned, creating confusion, sowing fear, but not actually attacking any of the men. Psychological warfare at its finest, courtesy of a boy who'd always been too gentle to hurt anything unnecessarily. The shot that followed disabled the second escape vehicle, sending Jake and his remaining men diving for cover behind the animal cages. Eli could see them now through his scope. 4 men with military-grade weapons pinned down by a single marksman and spooked by glimpses of golden fur moving through the shadows. "Listen to me," Eli called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Federal Wildlife Inspector is 20 minutes out. You've got one chance to surrender peacefully and walk away from this with your lives." Jake's response was a burst of automatic rifle fire that chewed splinters from the rocks above Eli's head. Clearly, peaceful surrender wasn't on the table. That's when the other wolves arrived. Thomas's call from the hour before had been heard and answered by every pack in the high country. Now they came slipping through the forest like grey and silver ghosts, not to attack, but to bear witness. They positioned themselves on the ridges surrounding the camp, golden eyes reflecting the sunrise, voices raised in a chorus that spoke of ancient authority and territorial justice. The psychological effect was devastating. The poachers found themselves surrounded by a tribunal of the very creatures they'd been caging and selling. These weren't domestic animals. These were the spirits of the wild mountain, and they were not pleased. "Jake," one of his men called out, voice cracking with fear. "There's got to be 20 wolves up there." "Maybe more," Through his scope, Eli watched Jake's face cycle through disbelief, fear, and desperate calculation. The man was realizing that he'd stepped into something far larger than a simple confrontation with a mountain hermit. But instead of surrendering, Jake made the worst possible choice. He grabbed a rifle and aimed it directly at the cage holding the wolf family. "Come down here, old man," he shouted. "Come down here or I put a bullet in these cubs." That's when Eli Boone discovered that 20 years of grief had not diminished. His capacity for protective rage, it had only concentrated it into something pure and terrible and absolutely unforgiving. The war was about to begin. Time slowed to the heartbeat between breaths as Eli watched Jake's rifle swing toward the caged wolf cubs. In that crystalline moment, 20 years of careful self-control evaporated like morning mist. This wasn't just about stopping poachers anymore. This was about a man threatening to murder children in front of their mother. Eli's shot took Jake's rifle apart in his hands, the bullet striking the weapon's receiver and sending twisted metal spinning through the morning air. Jake stumbled backward, staring at the destroyed weapon in shock, blood trickling from where flying debris had nicked his face. "Next shot goes through your heart," Eli called out, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd found his line in the sand. "Touch those cubs and I'll kill you where you stand." But Jake's 3 remaining men had recovered from their initial shock and were moving to flank positions, using the animal cages as cover. Eli could see their tactical training in the way they moved. These weren't just common criminals, but professionals who knew how to fight. That's when Thomas proved that love could transcend every law of nature. The golden wolf erupted from the forest like lightning made flesh, moving faster than any living creature had a right to move. But instead of attacking the men directly, he went for their weapons, supernatural jaws clamping down on rifle barrels, spiritual strength wrenching guns from human hands with casual ease. The first poacher screamed as his rifle was torn from his grip by what looked like empty air. The second man got off a wild shot before something invisible slammed into him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The third tried to run and found his path blocked by a wall of golden fur and blazing eyes that promised swift justice for anyone who threatened the innocent. Jake pulled a pistol from his belt, but before he could aim it, a raven dove from the sky and raked its claws across his face. Then another raven and another, until the air filled with black wings and harsh cries of outrage. Every creature on the mountain had heard Thomas's call, and they'd come to settle accounts with men who saw the wild world as nothing more than merchandise. Through the chaos of feathers and fur, Eli moved down from his ridge position with the smooth efficiency of a man half his age. Colonel Mitchell's training combined with a father's desperation to create something formidable. A guardian who would not be stopped, would not be reasoned with, and would not allow harm to come to those under his protection. He found Jake huddled behind the wolf cage, bleeding from raven scratches, trying to reload his pistol with shaking hands. When their eyes met, Eli saw fear there, not just of physical harm, but the deeper terror of a man who'd finally encountered something he couldn't buy, intimidate, or destroy. "You should have taken the surrender when I offered it," Eli said quietly, the muzzle of Mitchell's rifle steady as a mountain peak. "You don't understand," Jake gasped, desperation making his voice crack. "This is bigger than just me. There are people involved, important people, who won't let this operation fail." Then they picked the wrong mountain to fail on. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning air, multiple engines, coming fast up the valley road. Inspector Chen and her backup, arriving exactly on schedule. Jake's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "My people are armed better than some park rangers. This isn't over." But when the vehicles crested the ridge and came into view, Jake's face went white. These weren't more poachers. They were federal agents in full tactical gear, supported by wildlife officers and county sheriff's deputies who clearly weren't on Jake's payroll. Thomas appeared beside Eli, materializing from the forest like golden smoke. Blood matted the fur on his left shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. But his eyes burned with the same determined love that had carried him across 20 years and the boundary between life and death. "You're hurt," Eli said. Kneeling beside his son, the wolf made a soft sound that was pure Thomas, brave dismissal of his own pain, combined with concern for his father's safety. Some things never changed, even when they crossed between worlds. Inspector Chen's voice carried clearly across the camp. "Federal agents. Everyone on the ground, hands visible." Jake made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "These animals are legally purchased livestock. This man attacked us without provocation." Chen's response was to hold up a tablet displaying the photographs Eli had transmitted during the night. Detailed documentation of trap lines, cage-protected species, and poisoned water sources. "Jake Morrison," she announced, "you're under arrest for violations of the Endangered Species Act, the Lacey Act, and approximately 15 other federal wildlife statutes. You have the right to remain silent." As handcuffs clicked around Jake's wrists, Eli felt Thomas press against his leg, a gesture of completion, of a promise finally kept. Around them, federal agents began the careful work of documenting evidence and preparing the rescued animals for transport to rehabilitation facilities. The mountain was safe. The animals were free. And for the first time in 20 years, Eli Boone understood what it meant to fight for something greater than survival. The wolf died at sunset. 3 days after the battle that saved the mountain, Thomas had fought with everything he had. Supernatural strength channeled through a physical form that couldn't quite contain the power of a spirit's love. The bullet wound on his shoulder had seemed minor at first, but in the days that followed, it became clear that his time in the physical world was ending. Uki had carried him to the meadow where Sarah used to pick wildflowers. The same place where he'd proposed to her 35 years ago. The wolf, his son, lay on a bed of autumn grass with his head in Eli's lap. Golden eyes still bright but growing distant as another world called him home. "I know you have to go," Eli whispered, stroking the familiar fur that had become as precious to him as any human touch. "I know you've been away from Mama and Anna too long already." The wolf made a soft sound, gratitude and love, and the gentle exhaustion of a job well done. Around them, the rescued animals from the poachers' camp grazed peacefully in temporary enclosures while federal wildlife officials prepared for their release. The mother wolf and her cubs were already free, ranging through the high country where they belonged, safe because a boy's spirit had refused to let evil triumph on his family's mountain. Inspector Chen had stayed to oversee the cleanup, but she'd also spent hours listening to Eli's story with the kind of respectful attention that suggested she understood there were mysteries in the world that couldn't be captured in official reports. She'd arranged for the mountain to be designated as a protected wildlife corridor, ensuring that no one would ever again be able to exploit its resources for private gain. "Your son saved more than just animals," she'd told Eli the day before. His actions exposed a trafficking network that reached into 6 states. Hundreds of creatures will live free because of what happened here. Now, as the sun painted the western peaks in shades of gold and rose, Eli felt Thomas's breathing slow to match the rhythm of the mountain wind. The wolf's eyes found his father's face and held there, a look of perfect peace and completion. "Thank you," Eli said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "Thank you for coming back to me. Thank you for staying as long as you could. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't end. It just finds new ways to express itself." The wolf's tail moved once against the grass, the same subtle gesture Thomas had always used to show agreement. Then, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, his breathing stopped with the same quiet grace he'd brought to everything in life. Eli sat with his son until full darkness fell, surrounded by the sounds of a mountain returning to its natural rhythms. When he finally carried the wolf's body to the grove, where they'd found Colonel Mitchell's grave, he discovered something that made his heart catch: a young raven perched nearby, its eyes reflecting starlight with familiar intelligence. Some spirits, it seemed, found new forms to inhabit when their missions evolved. The raven would watch over the mountain now, as Thomas had always watched over the things he loved. Eli buried the wolf beside Mitchell's cairn, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross he carved from mountain pine. On it, he inscribed the words Thomas had written in his fever letter: "Family love is stronger than anything, even death." 1 year later, Eli was no longer alone on the mountain, but his solitude had transformed into something richer. He'd become the official caretaker of the new wildlife preserve, working with researchers and rangers who visited regularly to study the recovering ecosystem. His cabin had expanded to include a small office where he kept detailed records of animal movements, weather patterns, and the gradual healing of areas damaged by the poachers. Most importantly, he'd begun reaching out to the scattered relatives he'd abandoned in his grief. Letters to Sarah's sister in Oregon, phone calls to his brother in Montana, even an invitation for his nephew's family to visit next summer. The mountain no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It felt like a bridge, connecting him to all the love he'd thought he'd lost. On quiet evenings, when his work was done and the generator hummed softly in the gathering dusk, Eli would sit on his porch and speak to the wind. He'd tell Sarah about his day, share stories with Thomas about the young animals he'd helped rescue, and listen to Anna's laughter echoing from hidden places where children's spirits played eternal games of hide and seek. The raven often perched nearby during these conversations, tilting its head as if listening to words meant for more than human ears. Sometimes other creatures would join them, deer grazing in the meadow, foxes hunting in the undergrowth, the wolf family denning in the protected forest where their cubs could grow up free. The mountain had taught Eli its greatest lesson: love doesn't diminish when shared across the boundary between life and death. It grows stronger, more purposeful, more determined to protect everything sacred in a world that often forgot the meaning of the word. As winter approached and the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Eli carved a new wooden wolf, not to replace the one Thomas had made, but to honor the memory of a son who'd proved that some promises transcend every law of nature. He placed it on his mantle beside Sarah's cross and the faded family photograph, tangible reminders of the love that would always guide him home. Outside his window, the mountain settled into its seasonal sleep, secure in the knowledge that its guardian understood his purpose at last. Some men were called to build, others to explore, still others to lead or teach. Eli Boone had been called to protect, and in learning to protect the mountain, he discovered that his family had never truly left him. They'd simply changed form, becoming part of the wind and the stars, and the endless conversation between all living things. Love, it turned out, was the most persistent force in the universe, stronger than death, more enduring than grief, and always ready to find new ways to express itself when given the chance. The mountain knew this truth, and now finally so did Eli.